The first time Charles touched her hand, it was an accident. A brush of fingers over a plate of cucumber sandwiches at a debutante's garden party in the summer of 1970. He was 22, awkward in his stiff collar, and she was 17, with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes and eyes the color of the English Channel on a gray day. Her name was Camilla Shand, but it wasn't her hand he was supposed to be holding. The narrative of a prince's life is rarely his own to write. Though it was already being whispered in drawing rooms and printed in gossip columns that he might one day look towards Lady Sarah Spencer, a woman he had known since childhood. She was sensible, aristocratic, and utterly uninterested in the pomp of royal life, which, paradoxically, made her the perfect candidate. Sarah, with her blunt wit, introduced him to many people, but the most significant introduction was the one she probably thought nothing of. She reintroduced him to Camilla. This time, the touch wasn't an accident. At a polo match, the air thick with the smell of grass and horse, they talked and talked. He found he could tell her things he had never told another soul, about his lonely childhood, the crushing weight of his destiny, his love for the philosopher and the countryside. She listened, not with the fawning adoration he was used to, but with a glint in her eye and a witty, sometimes ribald, retort on her lips. She made him laugh, a deep, a genuine laugh that came from somewhere untouched by protocol. She was direct, unimpressed by the crown, and utterly herself. For a young man suffocating under the weight of expectation, it was like breathing fresh air for the first time. He was falling in love, deeply, hopelessly in love. He wanted to marry her. He broached the subject tentatively with those whose opinion mattered most. The response was a firm, gentle, but absolute refusal. The Queen Mother, his beloved grandmother, was particularly adamant. Camilla Shand, while from a respectable family, was not seen as suitable royal material. There was talk of her past, of a previous romance. But more than that, there was a sense that she was too worldly, too experienced. The heir to the throne needed a bride who was, above all things, unsullied by life, a blank canvas upon which the institution could paint its perfect princess. And perhaps, whispered the courtiers, he needed someone who didn't already hold such a powerful sway over his heart. Love was a luxury, duty was a mandate. Heartbroken and dutiful, he let her go. Within a few years, life moved them along the paths expected of them. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, an officer in the Blues and Royals, a man with a charm as polished as his cavalry boots. Charles, for his part, threw himself into his naval career, the ache in his chest a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his days. But the thread between them, thin as spider silk, was not broken. They remained friends. Their social circles overlapped, and in the polite, coded world of the British upper class, it was possible to be married to one person while holding a piece of your heart for another. It was an arrangement as old as the aristocracy itself. For years, they maintained a careful, proper friendship, but the feeling was never quite proper. It was a live wire, buried deep, so waiting for the right storm to expose it again. That storm arrived in the form of a ghost from the past and a future he couldn't escape. By 1980, the pressure on the 32-year-old prince to marry and produce an heir had become a national obsession. The press camped outside his door, scrutinizing every woman he spoke to. He was lonely, his brief flicker of happiness with Camilla now a distant memory he was told to forget. And so, his gaze turned, as it was perhaps always intended to, then towards the Spencer family. But not to Sarah, to her younger sister, Diana. She was everything he was told he should want. She was young, just 19. She was shy, her cheeks flushing a pretty pink whenever a camera was pointed her way. She came from an old, noble family. She was, on paper, perfect. She looked at him with a mixture of awe and adoration that was a balm to his weary soul. When he proposed, after a courtship of only a dozen or so meetings, she accepted. The world rejoiced. It was a fairy tale, and like all fairy tales, it had a shadow self, a truth that lived beneath the gilded surface. Throughout the courtship, he remained in close contact with Camilla. He sought her counsel. She was his confidant, the one person he felt truly understood the enormity of what he was about to do. In the weeks before the wedding, in a moment of bewildered honesty, he confessed to a friend, "I do love her, but it's so difficult. Camilla is my dearest friend." It was a fatal misstatement. He was marrying a woman to fulfill a duty while his heart remained in the custody of another. The young, sensitive Diana felt the presence of this other woman long before she understood its significance. It was a specter at the feast, a silent third person in the royal carriage. The wedding, on July 29, 1981, was a spectacle of such magnificent scale it seemed to belong to another century. 750 million people watched around the globe as the glass carriage clattered through the streets of London. Inside, Lady Diana Spencer, a vision in a puff of ivory taffeta and antique lace, sat beside her new husband. As the carriage passed through the crowds, a sea of smiling faces and waving flags, Diana's eye was caught. She leaned towards Charles, her voice filled with the innocent excitement of a new bride. "Look," she said, pointing, "there's Camilla." And there she was, and standing in the crowd, her son Tom on her shoulders. She was watching the procession, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. Charles's head whipped around. He followed Diana's finger, and for a fleeting second, his gaze met the woman in the crowd. What passed between them in that look? A shared memory? A silent acknowledgement? A promise for the future? Diana saw it. She felt the shift in the carriage, the sudden tension in his shoulders. It was a moment of pure, piercing clarity. But the fairy tale prince wasn't looking at his bride. In that instant, his attention, his very soul, had been pulled away by someone else. The cheers of the crowd faded to a dull roar, replaced by the thud of her own heart, heavy with a dread she couldn't yet name. The marriage was blessed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, but in that carriage, a seed of profound unhappiness was sown. It was a moment that would come to define the years ahead. The public spectacle of a union that, in private, was already fractured. The early years of the marriage were a desperate, clumsy dance between hope and despair. To the world, they were the golden couple, the shy prince and his adoring princess. They produced two beautiful, healthy sons, William and Harry, securing the line of succession. They performed their duties with grace, but behind the doors of Kensington Palace, a different story unfolded. Charles, carrying the baggage of his love for Camilla and the weight of his own emotional constipation, found himself bewildered by his young wife's volatile moods. Her crying fits, her dramatic outbursts, her desperate pleas for affection, they baffled and repelled him. He saw them as instability, a world away from the calm, unruffled companionship he craved. Diana, in turn, felt his withdrawal like a physical wound. She was a young woman thrown into a global circus, married to a man whose heart belonged to another. The loneliness was suffocating. It was in this vacuum of marital intimacy that Charles began to see Camilla again, not just as a friend, but as a lifeline. Their phone calls became more frequent, their meetings more clandestine. He would escape to her house, or they would meet at the homes of sympathetic friends. With Camilla, he could shed the prince and just be Charles. He could talk about his work, his frustrations, his love for gardening. She listened. She soothed. She made him feel seen. He told himself it was platonic, a meeting of minds, a solace denied to him at home. But it was more. It was the pull of a gravity he had never been able to escape. He was tethered to Diana by duty and his sons. but his heart was in orbit around another star. The secret meetings became a necessary drug, a brief respite from the cold, confusing misery of his marriage. He didn't see it as betrayal. He saw it as survival. He was a drowning man. And Camilla was the shore. The secret couldn't hold. The pressure of it was too great. In 1989, Camilla's sister, Annabelle Elliott, hosted a 40th birthday party for her brother. It was to be a simple, private gathering. But Diana, having become aware of the depths of her husband's relationship with Camilla, decided to confront it head-on. She insisted on attending. The atmosphere as she walked in was thick enough to choke on. Charles looked stunned, then deeply uncomfortable. Camilla, the ever-the-composed hostess, maintained a polite facade. But later in the evening, in a moment that has since passed into legend, Diana found Camilla in the nursery, talking to some of the children. Diana walked in. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. In a voice that was eerily calm, she said, "I would just like you to know that I know exactly what is going between you and my husband." Camilla, the consummate professional, looked at the young woman before her, the woman whose life she had inadvertently helped to shadow. She responded with a question that cut deeper than any insult. "You've got everything you ever wanted. You've got 2 beautiful children. What more could you want?" Diana, her voice barely a whisper, replied, "I want my husband." The exchange was devastating in its simplicity. It laid bare the entire tragedy. Camilla saw the marriage as a transaction, a successful one at that. Diana saw it as a love story gone horribly wrong. And for Diana, it was the ultimate confirmation of her suspicions. For Charles, it was the moment his 2 worlds, the public and the private, collided with shattering force. The charade was over. The secret was now an acknowledged fact, a wound that would never heal. The story was no longer a rumor. It was a reality that would soon explode into the public domain, fueling a tabloid war and setting the monarchy on a collision course with the modern world. And the years that followed were a descent into chaos. The War of the Waleses, as the press dubbed it, played out in leaked stories, tell-all books, and heartbreakingly candid interviews. Diana, in her infamous 1995 Panorama interview, uttered the words that would forever define the marriage. "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." She spoke of his relationship with Camilla with a raw, palpable pain that resonated with millions. The public, who had fallen in love with the shy Di, now saw her as a wronged woman, a victim of an uncaring system and a cold, unfaithful husband. Charles's popularity plummeted. He was cast as the villain. In a desperate attempt to tell his side of the story, he cooperated with Jonathan Dimbleby for a biography and a television interview. In it, he admitted to the affair with Camilla, but only after his marriage had irretrievably broken down. He spoke of Camilla as a friend for a long time and will continue to be a friend for a long time. It was a strategic disaster. The admission was seen as too little, too late, and his insistence on his own suffering only made him seem more out of touch. The Queen, finally, had had enough. The public bickering was damaging the monarchy beyond repair. In a series of handwritten letters to both Charles and Diana, she ordered them to divorce. The decree absolute was issued on August 28, 1996. The fairy tale was officially over. For Charles, it was a moment of profound relief, but also one of deep disgrace. He was now a divorced man, his reputation in tatters, the woman he loved reviled by a nation that blamed her for the princess's tears. Then came the car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. August 31st, 1997. The news hit the world like a physical blow. The Princess of Wales was dead. And in that moment, the narrative shifted again. All the anger, all the blame was redirected. The public's grief was monumental, terrifying in its intensity. and much of it was channeled into a white-hot fury directed at the Prince of Wales and his family. As the royal standard at Buckingham Palace flew at half-mast, the absence of a public statement from the Queen was seen as a cold, callous insult. The press screamed for a reaction, and the people laid a mountain of flowers and demanded to see their Queen grieve with them. For Charles, it was a test unlike any other. He was not just a divorced husband. He was the father of two young boys who had just lost their mother in the most horrific way imaginable. He had to shield them from the global storm while navigating his own complex, churning emotions: grief for the mother of his children, regret for the years of misery, and a chilling fear for his own future, and that of the monarchy. In the days that followed, he showed a strength and a clarity that many had never seen in him. He insisted on flying to Paris to accompany Diana's body home. He fought for the boys to be allowed to walk behind their mother's coffin, a decision that, while agonizing, allowed them to publicly honor her. And he stood beside his sons at the gates of Kensington Palace, looking at the endless sea of flowers, and accepting the grief of a nation that, just days before, had despised him. It was his finest hour. He was no longer the cuckolding prince, but a grieving father, a man trying to do right by his sons in the midst of a nightmare. For years after Diana's death, the relationship between Charles and Camilla existed in a kind of purgatory. Public hostility towards her was so fierce that it was dangerous. She was a virtual prisoner in her own home, vilified in the press, and Charles was determined not to lose her again. But he had to be patient. He had to wait for the public's grief to soften, for the anger to subside. Their relationship went completely underground. They lived separate lives, communicating by phone and meeting only in the utmost secrecy, often at the home of friends. It was a lonely, frustrating time, but it cemented their bond. They had weathered the ultimate storm. Slowly, cautiously, the rehabilitation began. A carefully managed campaign of soft introductions was orchestrated. The first public sighting of them together was at the Ritz Hotel in London in 1999, leaving a birthday party for Camilla's sister. They posed for the cameras, a single brief moment, and then slipped away. It was a toe dipped in the water. The public reaction was not the explosion of rage many had feared. It was more of a curious, cautious acceptance. The following years saw a steady, deliberate integration. But Camilla began to appear at semi-public events with Charles, always on the periphery, always with a smile. The press, once her enemy, began to soften. Here was a woman who made the prince happy, who was sensible, steady, and uncomplaining. She didn't seek the limelight, she simply stood by her man. The comparison with the tumultuous years with Diana began to work in her favor. People saw a calm, mature companionship. They saw a couple who laughed together, who seemed comfortable in their own skin. The woman who had once been the most hated in Britain was slowly, painstakingly being accepted. The final step was the biggest gamble of all. On February 10th, 2005, Clarence House released a statement. The Prince of Wales and Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles were to marry. The announcement was met with a collective intake of breath, then a surprising wave of support. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of compromise. It was a civil ceremony, and a first for a royal heir, held in Windsor Guildhall, followed by a service of prayer and dedication at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The Queen, who had once opposed the match, attended the service and hosted the reception. In her speech, she spoke with a warmth that surprised many, referring to Camilla as the person who makes my son very happy, a simple but powerful endorsement that signaled the complete acceptance of the woman she had once banned from royal circles. And the most poignant moment, however, came as they stood on the steps of the chapel, newly married. Charles looked at his bride, his face etched with the lines of 60 years, his eyes soft with a lifetime of feeling. He leaned in and, for all the world to see, kissed her. It was a simple, sweet, utterly unroyal gesture. It was the kiss of a man who had finally, after more than 3 decades of longing, loss, public humiliation, and private sorrow, been allowed to openly love the woman he had held in his heart since he was a young man at a polo match. It was not the passionate kiss of a fairy tale prince. It was something far more moving, the quiet, determined kiss of a man who had fought the world for his love and, against all odds, had won. The story did not end at the altar. It continued into the quiet, unspectacular years of a long marriage. Camilla, now the Duchess of Cornwall, had threw herself into royal duties with a diligence that won over even her harshest critics. She visited charities, supported causes close to her heart, and stood beside her husband through thousands of public engagements. She did not try to be Diana. She was simply herself, sensible, down to earth, with a quick laugh that could diffuse any tense situation. And Charles, for the first time in his adult life, seemed at peace. The haunted, lonely look that had dogged him for decades was gone, replaced by the contented expression of a man who had finally come home. They were a couple in their 70s, enjoying the simple pleasures, reading by the fire, walking their dogs in the Scottish Highlands, gardening together. It was a quiet, undramatic, deeply contented life. The final ultimate test of their bond came in the most profound way. On September 8, 2022, after a reign of 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II died peacefully at Balmoral. Charles, by the immutable law of birth and succession, became king. The moment of grief was also a moment of immense, terrifying responsibility. And in that moment, as he prepared to address a grieving nation for the first time as its sovereign, his thoughts, in part, were for the woman beside him. The next day, in his first speech as king, he paid tribute to his darling wife Camilla. He spoke of her love and support, and formally acknowledged the role she would play, by confirming her title as queen consort. It was the final, ultimate vindication. The woman he had held hands with in quiet despair, the woman the world had told him to release, the woman he had waited a lifetime for, would now be crowned queen beside him. On May 6, 2023, in the ancient grandeur of Westminster Abbey, she was. In the quiet of that evening, after the crowds had gone and the crowns were put away, they might have allowed themselves a moment to reflect. On a young woman laughing at a polo match, on a whispered phone call in the dead of night, on a garden party where it all began, on a lifetime of holding on,